Something big is happening right now, and it's shaking the entire energy market from Moscow to New Delhi. The fallout from the latest Russian sanctions is spreading fast, and countries everywhere are scrambling to figure out what's next. You've probably seen the rumors, whispers that Chinese oil majors have suddenly stopped buying Russian crude. But honestly, until we see hard data, that's hard to believe. What's more likely is that the US is trying to squeeze both China and India into cutting ties with Russia. Not just to punish Moscow, but to control the global oil game. Washington's logic is simple. If they can make sanctions bite deep enough, they can choke off Russia's energy exports and step in with US supply instead. And right on cue, Trump's team is already pitching this as a win-win. India loses Russian oil, but gets American barrels, maybe in exchange for lower tariffs or trade perks. Sounds like a great deal on paper, right? But the reality is way more complicated. Here's what's really going on. Russia's oil to India flows mostly through giants like Rosneft and Lukoil, together pushing more than 1 million barrels a day. That's huge. Cutting that off overnight would create a supply shock. And if the US does manage to block that route, China can easily step in as the middleman, buying Russian crude cheap, refining it, and quietly re-exporting it under new labels. So instead of isolating Russia, the sanctions might just reroute the flow through China. And that's where the real problem starts. This pressure campaign isn't just hurting Moscow. It's starting to hit Washington's allies too. Look at Germany. They're in panic mode right now, begging for exemptions from the very sanctions they agreed to. Why? Because several major refineries inside Germany are still partially owned by Rosneft, the Russian state oil company. After 2022, those assets were placed under German trusteeship, but they're still technically Russian, and that's a big problem. If the US decides to enforce sanctions to the letter, Germany's largest refinery, the PCK plant in Schwedt, could be forced to shut down. That single facility handles more than 12% of the country's refining capacity. Imagine that disappearing overnight. Fuel prices would spike, industrial production would nosedive, and supply chains would start breaking down. For an economy that's already shrinking, that's catastrophic. So now Berlin's trying to walk a tightrope, asking Washington for an exemption, while pretending to stand united against Moscow. And if the US agrees, it will expose something the rest of the world has long suspected. There's one rule book for the West, and another for everyone else. The UK already gave Germany a quiet pass earlier this month. If the US follows, it'll send a loud message to the global South. The system isn't fair. Meanwhile, Germany's industry is in freefall. Output just crashed by over 4%, the steepest drop in more than 3 years. The combination of high energy costs, Trump's tariff war, and now sanctions chaos has left Europe cornered. In a strange way, Trump has them exactly where he wants them. Dependent, anxious, and ready to concede. It's the art of the deal on a geopolitical scale. But not everyone's playing along. Over in Moscow, the response has been furious. Medvedev is calling this an act of war. Putin himself is warning that these sanctions will backfire. Not just on Europe, but on America. Because let's be honest, higher energy prices hit everyone. Inflation in the US is already creeping back up, and this move could make it even worse. And then there's China. Beijing imports roughly 20% of its total crude from Russia. Heavily discounted, reliable supply that fuels its manufacturing base. If the US ever tries to enforce sanctions on China's energy imports, that would be a massive escalation. It wouldn't just be about oil anymore. It would be about control over global trade itself. China now faces a choice: cut off Russia and risk losing cheap energy, or defy Washington and face financial isolation. And if history is any guide, Beijing isn't backing down. Giving in even once would confirm that US sanctions work. And that's the one thing China can't afford to prove. So what happens next? We're watching a full-speed collision between two global systems, one built on American financial dominance, and another rising around trade and resilience outside the dollar's reach. This isn't just about oil or tariffs anymore. It's about power, leverage, and who gets to set the rules of the world economy. If Trump's plan works, he gets control of global energy trade and keeps allies tied to Washington's system. But if it backfires, it accelerates the split, pushing Russia, China, and much of the global South into a parallel financial order. Either way, the balance of power is shifting right before our eyes. So, what do you think? Is this the moment the US finally reclaims dominance? Or the one where the rest of the world breaks free from it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Stay tuned. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe. We're just getting started. China's energy play has become far more strategic than anyone in Washington expected. In just 1 month, September, Beijing purchased over $5 billion worth of Russian fossil fuels. Around $3 billion came from crude oil, while the rest was made up of coal, natural gas, and LNG shipments. Now think about what that means geopolitically. Would China really walk away from this partnership? Doing so would not only abandon Russia, it would expose Beijing as the next major target for Western sanctions. And there's another layer to it. the currency. These transactions aren't being settled in dollars anymore. Nearly every deal now flows through the Chinese yuan or the Russian ruble. If Beijing reversed course, it would have to re-dollarize its trade, something the leadership considers unthinkable. The more the West tries to isolate them, the stronger China's resolve becomes to completely move away from the US dollar. That's why they're building independent payment networks like SIPs and accelerating their push for the digital yuan. But this shift has consequences. It's pushing China to dump US Treasuries. Not as an act of revenge, but out of self-preservation. For years, China has been one of America's biggest creditors. Even after recent sell-offs, when you include Hong Kong's holdings, Beijing still owns close to $1 trillion in US government debt. But that number is shrinking fast. Over the past 6 months, mainland China has reduced its holdings by roughly $54 billion, while Hong Kong trimmed another $26 billion. Some bonds are being sold, others simply allowed to mature without reinvestment. Beijing knows that if relations ever hit a breaking point, those assets, held by US custodians on American soil, could be frozen or confiscated overnight. So they're getting out before that risk becomes real. Where's the money going instead? Into gold, BRICS lending programs, and domestic industries. Into supply chains that strengthen China's own economy. Because to Beijing, US dollars are no longer a safe haven. They're a liability. Now, the big question. Will the US really sanction China for buying Russian oil? That's where things get messy. Because Beijing holds enormous leverage over America's agricultural sector, US farmers are already caught in a brutal squeeze. They want to sell their harvest to China, but Beijing has stopped buying. It's not just a slowdown, it's a full cutoff. Last year alone, China bought over $13 billion in US soybeans, roughly 20% of the entire American supply. But this year, 0 confirmed shipments from the new harvest. Not a single cargo. Trump knows what that means. He's considering a $10 billion bailout for farmers. But that's not a one-time fix. If he goes down that road, it'll have to happen year after year, season after season, until it becomes unsustainable. Even if Washington keeps buying up the excess crops to build national reserves, it won't make American farmers competitive. Costs will keep climbing, and once those subsidies stop, the collapse will be devastating. And remember, this isn't just about farms. The entire supply chain is taking a hit. Transporting millions of tons of soybeans from the Midwest to China is a huge logistical network, involving trains, depots, ports, and hundreds of local businesses. With China gone from the market, many of those systems are standing still. In states like North and South Dakota, shuttle trains that once moved constant freight now have 0 business. This is the domino effect of China's retreat from American agriculture. And if Washington pushes Beijing harder, by demanding an end to Russian oil imports, there's little reason to think China will suddenly start buying soybeans again. It's all coming to a head now. Trump's team is preparing for a crucial meeting with Chinese officials, just 2 days before November 1st, the date when tariffs are set to spike to 150%. If that meeting fails, markets could go into freefall. Trump wants several things from Beijing: relief from the rare earth export curbs, a lifeline for American farmers, and a reduction in Chinese energy purchases from Russia. But these are the very cards China holds closest. Beijing knows it has leverage, and Trump believes he still holds the winning hand. But this isn't a negotiation table anymore. It's a high-stakes game of survival, and both sides are running out of moves. So as the deadline approaches, the world is watching. Will Germany secure its oil exemption? Can American farmers survive another season of economic pressure? Or are we witnessing the early stages of a trade war that neither side can truly win? Stay tuned, because the next few days could redefine the global balance of power.